Welcome everyone. Thank you for taking out time and joining us in the first Resilience Vanguard series. Me and Nicole here, our co-founder and chief technology officer, will be walking you through what's been up at One Concern.
So today we are here at the Resilience Vanguard kickoff event, and we call it so because we've invited many different pioneers in the resilience technology space. Now we at One Concern, we are a 7-year-old company.
The inspiration behind the company was really my personal experience of experiencing natural disasters in my hometown in Kashmir. It's a seismically active place, and we, in late 2014, had a massive flood, which affected the majority of people, where they were wondering if they would survive, and that left a deep impact on me, where I started to wonder, why hasn't technology touched this sector?
Since then, we've launched across Japan, our products across Japan. We've also launched across so many different cities, and now we've invested in this massive effort for creating a digital twin, and we are so proud to now say that we'll be launching our first US-wide commercial release today at Resilience Vanguard.
So, we believe ESG is missing an R, the R for resilience. Like, think about it, owners of hard assets or financial assets globally right now are grappling with, the main question: how does climate affect my portfolio, the valuation of that portfolio? Are we going to have massive effects of hurricanes and typhoons affecting my cash flow?
We're launching one of the most sophisticated, high-resolution digital twin of the world we live in today. We call it One Concern Domino, and it's enterprise-ready SaaS platform which allows customers to really understand hyper-local climate change impact insights at the asset level, and we're also able to understand the impacts of infrastructure surrounding them.
So the two products we are going to be releasing today are called One Concern Domino and One Concern DNA, the data and analytics, or really the DNA behind Domino. Now, why it's called Domino is because of the focus on domino effects or ripple effects. Almost 4.5 years back, me and Nicole, we made a bet on the world being better represented as a graph rather than on a two-dimensional piece of paper. What that meant was we started to model every facility as a node on that graph, and the edges represented physical infrastructure, like roads, like water pipes, like power lines, etc. When you construct that graph, we call it the digital twin of a city. And a hurricane approaching merely disturbs that digital twin. It breaks off an edge or it disturbs a node, and now you can see these ripple effects, second, third order effects, sometimes emanating from hundreds of miles away. And that's what Domino and DNA are really focused on. And it's been a monumental effort, collecting and validating 14 trillion damage data points just for the US digital twin has been a massive effort.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today at the Resilient Vanguard event. We're so glad that so many pioneers in the resilience industry are here with us today. Now, if there's any questions, feel free to drop it into the Zoom chat, and we'll answer all of them at the end of the event.
Thank you, Nicole. We are super excited that you have taken out time to join us today. Next, coming up is a showcase of One Concern Domino and DNA.
When it comes to extraordinary and unprecedented climate events, businesses are leaving critical elements to chance. What if you had real-world data to show you how climate and disaster risk might impact not just your facilities, but your community and the wider infrastructure that powers your business? What if, instead of facing the unknown, hoping for the best possible outcome, you had more than hope? You had curated data, developed and orchestrated by leading disaster science, machine learning, and data modeling. One Concern Domino is a revolutionary risk intelligence software that's the key to resilient operational planning. Driven by the underlying data from One Concern DNA, our data and analytics as a service offering. Domino is a platform that allows you to understand climate risk and do something about it. Built using One Concern's digital twin, Domino is an interactive risk model of the natural and built environment that allows you to understand the impact of climate volatility and extreme weather on your assets, your infrastructure, and the world around you. Our unique data-based tools can help you discover your most critical vulnerabilities, create customizable scenarios to project potential downtimes with different hazards, planning horizons, and return periods. Predict which critical infrastructure will fail first, and model your overall climate risk exposure in a comprehensive view. From anticipating worst-case scenarios to performing due diligence for new facility acquisitions, asset valuation, and expansion, One Concern Domino helps you make smart, data-driven decisions so you can keep your assets and your business protected. One Concern Domino also allows you to easily download your curated data and analytics file that seamlessly integrates into your current workflows. For a broader portfolio analysis and customized data sets, One Concern DNA allows you to unlock a precise set of analytics and statistics on your assets and their dependent infrastructure networks. Disasters will strike, but you can stop them from devastating your business. With One Concern Domino and One Concern DNA, you have the tools to anticipate unseen risk and build resilience.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Bond, the Chief Strategy Officer for One Concern. I'm also in charge of research and solutions, and I'm excited today to talk about the DNA product. We've already heard a little bit about Domino. The underlying data, which delivers a range of resilience statistics, can be either consumed via Domino or this new product offering called DNA, or Data and Analytics. And I want to talk today about how one can think about these resilience analytics and the range of how they can be used. Now, before I get into the details of an example, I want to talk briefly about validation and the data science that we use at One Concern, because this is a very important part of what we are delivering. We have a very transparent offering where we make the methodologies available to our clients when they ask. We're very careful about validation when we look at each piece of the models that are used and the overall methodologies. And we've developed a technical working group that allows us to do peer review, similar to what you might experience in academic publications. So that gives our models an extra layer of robustness as they are being reviewed by experts that are not just internal to the firm, but also external to the firm. But most importantly, we're always doing more research, we're always finding new data sources. So we have a very dynamic data and model approach to developing these underlying statistics. Now I want to talk briefly about an example for how you can use these statistics. We have developed right now a exceedance probability, which we call the One Concern EP, or exceedance probability, which tells you the probability that some kind of a catastrophic event has taken a property beyond a threshold where we might see disruption. Now, one of the innovations in the One Concern technology suite is the fact that we look at the network effects. So we're trying to understand the dependent lifeline interactions of power, transportation, and also community. That allows us to have a richer model with respect to perils. Now, in this particular example on this slide, you can see that you can first do comparison. We pulled two properties from Miami to demonstrate how this would be done in practice. One could think about doing this in a larger portfolio as well to try to figure out where to prioritize analysis resources. Then we calculate an exceedance probability at a particular time horizon or planning horizon, as well as a downtime statistic. In this case, you can see that property A has a higher exceedance probability and a higher downtime related to all the possible perils that might cause disruption for that property. Now, the interesting piece that these tools facilitate is if we then condition on the components, such as different perils, for example, wind or flood, and also condition on the dependencies, such as power or transportation, we can drill into the specifics of what's contributing to the overall score. And further, we've added the ability to look at climate change. In this particular example, we're using RCP 4.5, which is a particular scenario related to targeted temperature rise for the climate. And finally, we can contextualize these data outcomes. We can look at them compared to a large number of similar properties in the existing geography. In this particular example, we looked at the quintiles, so that's breaking the sample into 5 buckets, and you find that the property A is in the highest bucket and property B is in the lowest bucket. This allows you to do the analysis both cross-sectionally and over time. So now we're going to move to a data visualization example on a larger set of data. This is actually for commercial properties in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this will provide you some idea of the types of analyses one can do across a larger set of data. If we look at this video, we can see, first of all, that we are starting with a map of San Francisco, and we can understand across multiple dimensions, such as construction type and property type, as well as location, what are the downtime statistics for different properties. This allows you to quickly understand how it fits into the larger picture. Then we can compare across different dimensions that will be of interest to the analysts, such as size, as well as when the property was built, and most importantly, how far it is from, say, a power substation. This is an example of the dependent lifeline analysis that we are facilitating. We can then calculate our downtime average. In this case, we're looking at the conditional downtime, and we're essentially trying to understand the relationships between the size of the properties, the types of the properties, as well as the year that they were built. And this further graph that shows the proximity to substations really makes concrete the analysis that one can do with DNA. Because you can see, as the property is further away from the substation, in this map view, you can see that the heat map shows redder areas. These are properties that are going to have a longer downtime, given that they're far away from the substations. And those that are closer are a lighter color, and they would have a lower downtime. This provides some idea of the type of analysis that one can do with OneConcern DNA. We've kind of raced through a simple example of comparing properties and then looked at a larger sample of data for one geographic region. I think the important thing to take away from this is these statistics will allow you, as an analyst, looking at resilience for commercial properties as a function of perils and the dependencies, the extent to which we will see downtimes in the event of catastrophes. This can then be used for a variety of use cases, ranging from portfolio selection, property comparison, monitoring property over time, doing return on mitigation investment analysis, and most recently we figured out a way to do resilience-adjusted valuation, which would allow asset managers to understand how the value might change as a consequence of the resilience of the properties. We're quite excited about the range of things that clients can do with this technology and these underlying statistics, and we look forward to collaborating with you in understanding how they can be applied in a wider range of applications. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Joe Pileska and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for OneConcern. I'm delighted to have one of our advisors join us today, Steve Howard, the Chief Sustainability Officer for Temasek, joining us from Singapore. Good morning, Steve, how are you?
Great to be with you, Joe.
And Steve, as long as I've known you, you have been one of the greatest advocates for change and activism around climate change. And I wanted to know if you could just share some of your key takeaways from the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow last fall.
Well, obviously, COP came in the middle of a pandemic and it had been delayed a year already. But it was, in some ways, it was the business and finance COP, because the business and finance community turned up in force ready to engage much more meaningfully on climate. The political situation, despite really challenging geopolitics, the world's mostly decided to agree on climate action. So that was another big plus. And this COP was the one where really about loss, adaptation, and resilience, that came through as a really strong theme, because now we've seen extreme weather isn't a distant reality. It's a day-to-day in different parts of the world. So, and that's going to carry through. So into Egypt this year, into UAE afterwards, this theme of how do we tackle this? How do we deal? How do we have a more better adapted and resilient society is going to be front and center.
And Steve, when you say it's really the business and finance COP, or that's the way it should be viewed, and you know our position that ESG is missing an R for resilience. How do you think resilience now impacts the financial sector?
I think, we've seen obviously the orange day in the Bay Area with the orange skies, or defining forest fires that we've seen in Australia, around the world, the flooding, the extreme flooding, the storm increase. So people are aware of this now in a way. I would say it's probably built dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years, but really over the last decade, that we cannot just let ourselves run into climate change without being better prepared. And so businesses are starting to think, what does this mean in terms of supply chain disruption? The financial sector, they're looking at a combination of climate risks. How ready are you to transition to the clean economy? What's your exposure on fossil fuels? But how adapted are you to a 1.5 degree world, a 2 degree world, or let's hope not, but a 2.5, 3 degree world? So that the financial community's really starting to look at this and know that this is something that's going to bite already and only get more dramatic over time.
And Steve, you know that we're working on a resilience score to quantify and measure consistently resilience. And how would effectively a credit score for physical risk, how would that change outcomes within the boardroom or within Wall Street?
I think we've generally been poor. We're sort of really good at dealing with emergencies or risks after they've happened, which isn't kind of the best way to do it. And when you can sort of price it as an investor, when you can see that there's company A relative to company B is much more resilient, that's going to affect your investment decisions, especially for long-term investors in this. And if you're a risk officer in a business, or tomorrow you're a resilience officer in a business, the new C-suite title, then again, you can benchmark yourself against your peers, and really few people aspire to be, a triple C rating or something. Everybody would want to be AAA for resilience.
Interesting. And Steve, I guess my last question would be, how do we galvanize the momentum behind climate adaptation and resilience? And so that's not just a fad. Yeah.
I mean, we know we've got 2 big focuses on climate. So mitigation, reducing emissions, that's a absolute defining challenge for our generation. And we see we're now into the race for net zero. Hundreds and hundreds of companies have signed up for it, about 3,000 for science-based targets. And we've also seen up to, I think it's about 85, 90 countries have net zero targets. Lots of countries have declared a climate emergency. In an emergency, you need to be prepared. So we know extreme weather, even with our best efforts, we are going to get 3, 4, 5x the extreme weather we have today with our best efforts. We've seen just NOAA come out now saying that on the East Coast there's going to be a 10-fold increase in floods by mid-century. That's sort of baked into the system. So unfortunately, extreme weather is coming, and it's coming again and again and again. So we have to be prepared. And I think that people have got that now. But it's now for companies like One Concern and others to say, how can we do that in a smart way? How can we make sure we invest in the right ways to give the best benefits to business, to society, to communities? And it's a new discipline for the 21st century.
Fantastic. Steve, I really appreciate you taking the time to participate in our event. I really appreciate your insights as well.
Joe, it's a pleasure.
Likewise.
Ben, thank you for joining us today. Allow me to introduce you to our audience. Ben is the global head of core analytics at Willis Towers Watson. He essentially drives innovation at the intersection of digital client engagement, data and analytics, and risk for the organization. You know, Ben, you and I have talked a bit about the power of data and analytics in putting risk at the center of the bullseye. Could you share your perspective on this and moving the needle in your space?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Happy to be here. Yeah, well, I mean, we always consider risk first, solution second. So we always put the client's view first. And in our industry, that wasn't always the case. And to do that, really bringing a level of transparency of risk to promote understanding is critical. And a lot of our clients, right, they'll have their own and sometimes biased view, and they know their business better than anyone. But it's our job to bring data, technology, expertise, and models and algorithms to our clients to help them translate all those things and their knowledge to come up with that view of risk.
So I'm going to share my screen with you now and jump into Domino. Right, I've uploaded the Boston Convention Center to help explore this issue and to help kind of drive in the point as to what it is we're talking about when we're talking about external vulnerabilities. So we start with a sense of what the Boston Convention Center is. Right, it's a brand new facility. It's a green, certified silver LEED facility. It's built on a pier, funnily enough, in the Boston Harbor. Right, you and I have both been there. It's beautiful, right, and it is hardened against flood. You'd think that they really had a view of their physical risk or their exposure to flood risk figured out, right? But when we understand risk beyond the fence and look into the externalities, right, and are able to drill down into what are those components that drive vulnerability, right? Even for a 1 in 250 year flood event, we see that the building itself is undamaged, which is what we'd expect out of a brand new facility. And if you'd plotted this on a GIS map, right, and you talk to the risk manager of the convention center, they'd say, our building is flood risk free, so to speak, from a 1 in 250 perspective. But what we find instead is that there's extraordinary vulnerability. There's extraordinary vulnerability to flood risk for the convention center, for its business operations. Communities are down for 2 weeks. That means people aren't coming into the convention center to work. They're not coming to the hotels or the restaurants to work, right? Which means that the business that the convention center enables and its revenue streams are impacted, even though it's fine, by the fact that folks aren't coming into work, right? The ports are closed. The airport is closed for 4 days. Right? That means that folks aren't flying in to go to the conventions, and the power itself is out for 3 days. And of course, there's highway impairment as well. Right? When we think about these kinds of networked exposures, when we think about these dependency risks, right, that manifest, right, for organizations where they're there, but they're really hard to quantify, right? And if you can create a quantification frame around that, can you move the needle on closing the protection gap? And that's kind of the topic I'd like to just briefly get into now. How do you really feel about the potential for this capability to move the needle in this kind of parametric insurance space, to kind of get to the quantification and closing the protection gap around these external vulnerabilities that cause downtime, that really drive impairment? Ben, what do you think about that?
Sure, yeah, and I really thought that demo was pretty cool, showing how this risk analysis can be, laid upon this connected world we live in, right? It's not just about your asset protection. It's about resiliency. It's about much more than that. I think it's all about understanding your risk and the impacts, and that includes not the physical asset piece. So it opens up a whole new set of solutions that we can provide once you understand the impacts and the risk itself. So in this modern age of data and technology, you can analyze things like parametric nerves, and sometimes the basis risk uncertainty is a lot less impactful than the risk modeling of the asset itself. So all these things are at our fingertips now where they really weren't, 5-10 years ago. So certainly it's a great great way to, at a minimum, supplement traditional insurance forms and could replace them in many ways. So it's really exciting. And some of the most exciting things that I work on are in that space.
I really appreciate your time. Right? I really appreciate your collaboration with us and kind of bringing this conversation forward. Right? And I'm very grateful that we have an opportunity to kind of explore these issues. Right? Because when we think about these shared priorities around closing the protection gap, when we think about these, the kind of view of the world through digital engagement in order to kind of engage clients, in order to engage enterprise, in order to kind of shape a new world with respect to decision makings on risk finance strategy as it is at Willis Towers Watson. And for us, decision making around understanding resilience risk with a view towards natural catastrophe and climate adaptation. Right? There's a lot of synergy and connection points there. And I'm very grateful for you sharing some time and your perspective on this with us today.
Great. Thanks, Sean. And thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to trailblazing with you folks.
Indeed. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Take care.
Before we move on to our next interview, I'd like to showcase an analysis we've conducted, which we have found has particular resonance when talking to clients and prospects about issues of dependency risk and different decision making.
Let's say your CEO just pledged to put 4 million square feet of solar power and battery backup on warehouse roofs. Right now, you're challenged with where to put it. Do you spread it all out evenly across your warehouse footprint? Do you allocate solar panels to the highest cost of energy, which of course is transitory, so you can try to maximize ROI? Or do you expand the ROI algorithm to capture avoided downtime? The downtime you avoid by being operable while the power's out, and the advantage you gain while being operable while others are impaired. You can now target deployment of solar panels and battery backup based on where it's needed most, not spread evenly across your system, but targeted to where it will deliver maximum business resilience. You can see now that by narrowing focus on power as a dependency, you can both focus priorities to the purple facilities over the gray ones. You will match resilient systems to vulnerability, and in doing so, by considering how power grid risk emerges in consideration of climate change across time and across planning horizons. Doing so links physical risk and climate adaptation to net zero transition goals, delivering amplified return on investment, bringing the R for resilience into ESG.
Bill, thank you very much for joining us today. Very nice to see you. I'd like to take a moment and introduce you to our audience. I'm joined today by Bill Knightley, the Chief Executive of Global Occupier Services at Cushman & Wakefield. And I've really enjoyed the conversations we've been having to date. When we first met a few months ago, you commented that your clients on both sides of the business, asset owners and occupiers, are increasingly demanding that you have a perspective on climate adaptation risk and resiliency in the delivery of your services. Could you put some color on that for our audience?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Good to see you again. I've also enjoyed the conversations. You're absolutely right. So climate change and variability affects all aspects of society today, and we have to adapt how we do business. If we back up and start maybe with the occupier side of real estate, we're spending a lot more time now looking at service delivery through the lens of what if, what's a worst case type scenario. Yeah. And as a client, you want us to be prepared for a severe climate event. Of course, we rely on our deep operational expertise to develop practical plans to manage things like access points, heating, lighting, water, et cetera. And you would expect us to do this for maybe more traditional disaster planning, thinking earthquakes, hurricanes, stuff we've had a lot of experience with over the years. But in addition to that, we're increasingly doing similar planning for other extreme events. Don't have to go too far behind us to talk about something like the Texas freeze last year. Yeah. That was major disruptions. Beyond the facility management side, we're also advising clients on the portfolio strategy. And so a component of this is site selection. Resiliency is definitely emerging as a hotter topic, in addition to the more traditional discussions around labor analytics, tax incentives, and some of the other relevant considerations in that conversation. So that's maybe some of the highlights on the occupier side. If you shift over to investors for a moment, I think it'd be fair to say that there's probably at least equal demand from the investor perspective. Some would argue that most of the investor interest is driven by shifting tenant or occupier expectations Obviously now that's increasing by regulatory changes, societal expectations. Quite simply, it's not good enough anymore to have LEED and WELL certifications and high Energy Star scores. So the large institutional investors are building ESG rankings, and these ESG rankings include climate risk and resilience. It's embedded obviously into their investment criteria, and oftentimes it's coming with a fairly material weighting in that investment criteria. What we're seeing with our clients is that this is a topic that not only is being analyzed prior to an investment opportunity, but also during the whole period, as things change around us in the environment.
I can see a place where, or the time in the near future where this kind of work and this kind of analysis, this kind of insight is going to be table stakes in that side of the business, and both sides of the business, really, if that's the case.
Yeah, I think you're right. Unfortunately, I think we're inevitably heading down to increased severe weather events and probably more material climate change. So it's certainly something that people need to be ready for on both sides.
Indeed. As you know, One Concern distinguishes itself by providing visibility not just into the direct risk properties face, but also the extended risks business face by virtue of external infrastructure fragility. We come to this through the quantification of downtime. Right? So how do you think about downtime as a characterization of resilience risk in the commercial real estate space?
First of all, downtime is a bit of a dirty word in our business. We don't like to talk about downtime, but we certainly like to plan to avoid downtime. I think all of us have learned a lot about the impact of downtime in the context not only of climate events, but certainly through the pandemic, whether you're considering it through the lens of a critical environment like a data center or something more macro like the global supply chain. But to your question, downtime is a very visible, very clear characteristic of the quality of resiliency planning. I'll go back to the Texas freeze, Sean, if you don't mind. You take data centers last year, and we had several clients in the region that have data centers. For those clients, it was less about redundancy for those data centers and thinking about downtime, and more about downtime from the perspective of how much diesel fuel do you have on hand, and how much more diesel fuel can you procure during an extended event. So for a real estate services provider like Cushman & Wakefield, we very much value our supplier relationships, and through those strong supplier relationships, we're able to procure fuel. But that was a real serious challenge because of the duration of the downtime in the power grid. And so, like I said, it wasn't really about a redundancy, which you often think of with downtime, but more the extended nature of the duration with the power grid. Yeah. You take that one step forward, right? And I think our clients, and certainly us as service providers, are going to have to think about what's first to fail, what's the duration of downtime in a more sophisticated manner than we have in the past.
Now, as you can imagine, we couldn't agree more on that particular point. We've been talking through both insights and use cases in our program today. How do you see functions like site selection, highest and best use, mitigation, you've alluded to some of this already, diligence and screening, and even valuation playing out differently when you can see these external infrastructure vulnerabilities, when you can see the power downtime outage, the likelihood, the exceedance probabilities, when you can see through the bridges being out or the roads being impaired and communities being impacted? How do you see that kind of playing out in that particular sector?
Yeah, it's a heavy question. I think infrastructure vulnerabilities are certainly changing the traditional ways of thinking in real estate. And part of the issue is kind of an obvious question, but what do these changes require us to make changes, and how are those things going to evolve? And the other thing I'd say about your question, Sean, is everything in it is somehow interrelated, I think. And we're going to have to get very sophisticated, I'll use the word again, and intentional in considering all of a particular site's vulnerabilities as well as its strengths so that you can make a better decision. So take a simple example. Maybe you have a location where the electricity supply is variable in quality, and the accessibility is also variable, but it happens to be a low-cost labor environment. That variability in electricity, or maybe it's prone to a climate event, I think is going to have a heavier weight than maybe in years past where labor arbitrage was a more dominant factor. And so you need to think about things like what cost will this, how do you take those costs into account of having less reliable electricity? How would you position secondary power supplies? How would that total cost, if you will, be weighed against choosing a location with a lower risk factor, maybe a higher resiliency factor in your vernacular, balancing the other considerations? I think go one step further, you expand that scope to include other factors, such as maybe assessing the neighborhoods that your workforce or even public service employees are living in, the modes of transportations that they are taking to and from their place of employment. All these things, I think, will become increasingly important because, after all, if your building's operational, and maybe previously that's what you were focused on, but nobody can get to it, you're still going to have a problem.
Yeah, no, indeed. And one of the things I also think about in that same context is business continuity planning today, right? Is an art form, right? And thinking about mitigation, right? When you think about power mitigation, many times it's a play against the cost of power from the pole, right? But if we can break up those ROI algorithms and think about avoided downtime, right? It can really sing. We can really amplify the results that you can get through mitigation activities, right? And when you can really think through the fact that the future is not going to look like the past, right? Forward-looking models are how we can kind of get at understanding climate adaptation and change in our space. It can actually change the mode a little bit and actually make decision-making differentiated. So I know Cushman & Wakefield's been doing a lot to engage technology, analytics, and value creation insights in order to take a leadership position in this particular space. And of course, we're working hard to be a part of that with you, right? Quite naturally. How do you see you guys making that strong play, right? How's that going to sing for you?
Well, first off, thank you for the recognition. It's something we absolutely are very focused on. And just kind of coming back to your closing remarks on the last question, Sean, I think there's an enormous opportunity for the commercial real estate industry to better leverage technology and data. And we certainly have seen that accelerate through the COVID experience, whether you're talking about smart buildings or any other number of things. We're seeing that already. So I think these two things colliding is somewhat natural at this stage in the industry's transformation. The way we think about it, first off, is that Cushman & Wakefield has to have a voice in the discussion, and we need to have a point of view. Sometimes I hear folks say, we're agnostic because we believe in being integrators. I don't like that terminology because I think as an advisory firm, it's important for us to have a point of view in this space.
Yeah.
But more than anything, it's about getting the outcomes, and that's what we're focused on. So how can the data, how can the technology, how can these insights drive meaningful value creation for our clients? And we believe in a partnership philosophy. You and I have spoken about this before. We have a thesis that we're better positioned to serve our clients by partnering with the world's leading technology and analytics firms to make sure that we're staying ahead of the curve with what's best of breed and the latest and greatest to deliver the best outcomes for our clients. So whether we're talking about maintaining facilities, selecting new sites, performing valuation work, advising investors who are selling an asset, we need to have a point of view. And we have to bring the best tech available in the marketplace to those clients. It applies across all of those service lines that you mentioned. Take it another step further, across every aspect of our client service, ESG, and now increasingly R, although I would argue R is embedded in a lot of the ways that we think about ESG, certainly as it relates to regulatory reporting, et cetera, is a bigger priority. But like I would think most firms, we know there's a lot more we can do in this space. And of course, we're actively recruiting, we're finding strong partners to work with. And, in closing on that question, Sean, what I would say is, from a Cushman & Wakefield perspective, starting with our most senior executive leadership all the way down to our newest team members, we're 100% committed to doing what it takes to make a difference here and to address, what's next, what's in front of us.
Well, Bill, I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate you spending the time with us today. I'm going to wrap up our interview with a thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me, Sean. It's been a phenomenal learning experience for me as we've gotten to know each other better.
Yeah, and for me as well. This has been great fun. And again, thank you for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to our burgeoning partnership. I think we're going to have a lot of fun there too.
Likewise.
All right, cheers, Bill.
My name is Jeffrey Bond from One Concern. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Research.
I'm Carl Brooks. I'm Global Head of ESG for Property Management at CBRE. I'm based in the UK, but looking at kind of ESG across our property management division globally.
And this morning, we wanted to talk about the trends of ESG and the addition of resilience into that picture. We call that ESG plus R. But specifically from the property perspective, given your position and experience and the data that you look at, could you talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing in climate adaptation exposure, as well as the whole question of ESG disclosure in the space?
Yeah, sure. So quite a big topic, obviously, in terms of like all the kind of different indicators that we capture around that space. I think for a number of years now, we've been sort of very much concerned around tracking kind of energy and carbon data as it relates to mitigation of climate change, I guess. But I think where we are now with looking at the kind of decarbonisation strategies out to 2050, following the Paris Climate Agreement, we are starting to look at the kind of risk that sits around the kind of buildings and the inability of buildings to decarbonise and what the likely impacts of kind of changing climate will be on real estate. So the conversation has kind of switched kind of away from just kind of operational management of carbon emissions to what the implications of a changing climate are on real estate, and clearly looking at sort of how we measure the resilience of specific buildings in particular locations, which then inform the overall sort of investment strategy for that property or fund.
And from my perspective, we've seen this trend starting maybe 15 or as many as 20 years ago, where socially responsible investing kind of morphed into this ESG, environment, social governance, and particularly the environment piece, I think, has taken hold. In the early days, the environment didn't seem to be priced into asset valuations. And then several years went by, and starting a few years ago, at least the data I've looked at shows that that's starting to happen to some extent, things related to, say, carbon emissions. The resilience space is quite new. It's a new extension. Often I call this ESG plus R. Could you talk about where you think we are in the cycle with respect to resilience and whether we're starting to see that priced at all into real estate valuations?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly starting to be looked at, and I think really, where we are right now is kind of a product of the fact that those environmental considerations haven't been made over the years. So we are working with a built environment stock which hasn't really been designed with the long-term sort of impacts of kind of environmental change in mind. But what that also means is they're quite sort of challenging to treat. So taking the kind of questions around the kind of steps that are required to sort of decarbonize the built environment, we're having to sort of look at the level of investment required to remove emissions from properties in properties that weren't really designed with that in mind. So the kind of questions around resilience are increasingly being asked context of whether or not a specific real estate asset is able to decarbonize to the extent required, and if not, what does that mean for the value of that investment over the sort of medium to long term horizon. So these are all very sort of real conversations that are happening now with our clients, and they're only going to get sort of broader and wider and deeper as we move forward.
And then the final question, since this is a data and analytics section of this discussion, one of the challenges in the space are, in fact, collecting the right data. And then after that, trying to develop suitable models to do climate change driven resilience analysis. 10 years ago, a lot of people would have said, myself included, that it was too early, not enough, maybe not enough modeling, understanding, et cetera. My own view is the world has changed, and now we do, in fact, have emerging data sets. We have understanding from a modeling perspective. What's your view on the state of data and analytics, particularly as it applies to specifically resilience analysis and resilience-adjusted valuation and resilience-adjusted risk modeling?
We very much view data as gold here. And the more data we have and the more data we can overlay, the more data sets we can overlay with each other, we can bring those kind of richer insights into what the data is actually telling us in kind of real terms. I think what we're finding from an ESG perspective specifically is that's really an area of our business which we're expanding hugely. We've adopted a platform solution in the UK to kind of aggregate all of our sort of ESG related data for the properties that we manage, and then kind of overlay that with a wider sort of data set in the business so we can start to analyze kind of asset value at risk, rental income at risk, as well as the sort of likelihood of achieving the kind of required carbon emissions reductions. I think more kind of generally as it kind of relates to value, we've sort of seen over the years a real increase in interest, unsurprisingly, from kind of insurance and reinsurance companies around collecting this data, because they absolutely see the need to kind of analyze the likely impact of a changing climate on the likely levels of claims that are going to be around certain properties. So I think as those data sets mature alongside the kind of increasing legislative or voluntary drivers around kind of reporting on this data, we're going to sort of start to really improve and broaden that data set. And I think resilience is going to be absolutely key to that, because from an operational standpoint, we need to understand what the likely impact of the changing climate will be on the need to kind of maintain that building. So if a facade is being battered more frequently by storms and heavy rain, there's going to be an increased maintenance requirement there. Similarly, if a building is located in an area where during a period of flooding, for example, there's no way of accessing that building, that has a huge kind of effect on how that building would be valued if it can't actually be used for its intended purpose. So I think all of the sort of the kind of strands are converging around what we're doing, but we certainly kind of see resilience as being key to ensure that we're able to give even better advice to our clients as to where they need to invest or where they might need to review their hold or sell strategies.
And just to confirm, the resilience adjustment to these models, this is all now quite feasible. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's amazing now. The kind of amount of data available to us is just incredible. And if you get the right sets of data being kind of pulled together into the right sort of platform and overlaying that information together, you get a really sort of deep, rich kind of data set there, which gives you the insights that you need. But yeah, like the amount of information we have available at our disposal now, all that's available in the marketplace is kind of mind-boggling. It really is.
All right. Thank you very much for your time.
No, my pleasure.
General Petraeus, thank you for taking the time today to join us.
Thanks, and thanks for all that you did during your time in government and for what you've done since leaving government as well.
What are the effects of climate change on national security?
You're keenly aware, obviously, of the ways in which climate change does become a problem in actual national security terms. Climate change, obviously, is associated with, as an example, increased droughts, or on the other hand, increased fire risk. But the droughts in particular, if you think of Africa and you think of the growing desertification, as it's termed, that then results in the movement of populations, and populations move into other areas and you have clashes, and those can become very quickly not just security risks in those areas, as serious as those may be, but risks for areas beyond that. This is another one of those cases in which Las Vegas rules don't apply. What happens in these areas that are affected because of greater droughts, or because of wars over water or grazing rights, or because of extreme weather that causes, again, greater migration associated with, for example, terrible earthquakes in locations. It is very easy, I think, to connect all of these aspects of climate change to various causes of real security concern, and that can result in real national security challenges, not just for our country, but for many other countries around the world, including those of allied and partner nations.
That then leads to my next question, because we talk about the problem, and you and your experience as a combat commander in intelligence communities, you know the problem probably better than a lot of people. But what steps can nations and societies take to address climate security?
And it's not just resilience of critical infrastructure, as important as that is, it's literally resilience of communities. It is steps to be taken to, again, mitigate the risks associated with rising sea levels. It may be literally to relocate communities in anticipation of what inevitably is going to happen as a result of climate change, of sea levels rising, and of these other aspects of climate change that we've discussed.
But we also have seen something else happen with climate impacts. We've seen disruptions to the global supply chain. What kind of international cooperation does the U.S. need to have with its partners to build climate resilience in these supply chains?
First of all, what you should do is not have a supply chain, an aspect of your supply chain, say either the production or the assembly or what have you, that is just concentrated in one location. I think that has been reaffirmed or revalidated as a big idea during the pandemic. But another aspect is, again, to examine what will the likely effects be of, again, X, Y, Z, and so forth of climate change, and to determine in advance, to model, to look at the effects, to identify what the risks are, then to determine what the most significant risks are, and then obviously to identify how to mitigate those. It's not what do we need to do, it's what do we need to do most immediately. And anything that can help with that, obviously, is really of enormous value.
Given that all of these above subjects we talked about comes down to something that we need to think about, what are we going to do differently? What's your top recommendations for companies and governments on building climate resilience?
The challenge will be different in different locations because of the way that weather changes will, or that climate changes will affect various aspects that threaten these locations. And again, then what has to be done is this process of determining what presents the greatest risk, how do you mitigate it, and that's where the marginal dollar should be spent. So I think that's an awfully important element of this. And again, the modeling that is required for that can be extraordinarily helpful in a whole host of different ways.
Well, General Petraeus, I just want to tell you, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. Very helpful to help frame the discussion. Thank you, sir.
Again, Craig, the pleasure and honor have been mine. And thanks again for what you've done in this area over the years in government and also in the private sector.
Great, thank you. I want to take the opportunity to thank our guests again, General David Petraeus of KKR, Steve Howard with Temasek, Ben Fidlow, Willis Towers Watson, Bill Knightley, Cushman and Wakefield, and Carl Brooks with CBRE. I'd like to give the first question to Jeff. Jeff, what's the core differentiation for OneConcern?
Yeah, great question. There's 4 areas where we differentiate ourselves. First is models and methodology, and that's our ability to go down to the property level, provide consistent analytics across time and across properties, and look not just at direct damage, but also the network effect. Second is data. We're curating a lot of data that many institutions don't necessarily have available, or they don't have available in a clean form. Third is the technology suite that can be used in a variety of ways, including integrating into existing systems. And fourth, and most importantly, is you're joining a community of people that are focused all the time on resilience modeling, understanding how climate impacts that, and really getting into the details. It's hard to find that community anywhere in the world today.
Great. And Sean, I've got another question from the audience. What's the competitive advantage that clients get by working with OneConcern?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. A few comes to mind, and I would say it starts with who you are. Depends on who you are, pretty much, right? So if you're in the space where avoiding disruption is kind of your job, right? Whether you're in commercial real estate doing advisory for site selection or highest and best use, right? Whether you're on the enterprise side thinking about business continuity planning or supply chain, right? Whether you're in a space where avoiding disruption is in that mandate, Right? One Concern enables you to do that. Right? And through avoiding disruption, you not just avoid missed revenue, right? So there's a commercial advantage there, right? But then you also capture the disruption advantage. The idea that you're up while other people are down, and through that you can capture market share, and in doing so, right, improve your financial outcomes, right? And in that particular mode, One Concern can act like your resilient system of record, with continuous engagement around exploring and understanding the vulnerability of your business to external fragility of infrastructure, and in doing so avoid disruption and capture those two commercial advantages. If you're in the insurance sector, I think that the insurance sector has a unique brand permission to talk about risk, right? And in that particular environment, we see two critical areas. The first being risk engineering, where you can extend the risk engineering mandate beyond property into those vulnerabilities outside the fence. And in doing so, engage clients in a way that they lean to you for that advisory and lean to you, of course, for that insurance solution beyond that. And that gets into the second area, which is really moving towards closing the protection gap, which is a critical function, a critical priority for us. You heard about that when I was talking to other folks earlier in our program, particularly Ben. And when we're closing the protection gap, the first move there is around pricing risk, understanding the quantification of external vulnerability risk, or resilience risk in our parlance, and then moving towards modes where we can close that gap, whether it's through accelerating the adoption at scale of parametric trigger programs and or moving towards non-damage business interruption more broadly. And then lastly, right, if you're in the financial markets environment, when you're thinking about valuations, whether on the valuation side, the lending side, the ownership of asset side, you're thinking about those valuations and you need to understand those, you need to bring stability to financial markets around that. Right? Through One Concern, we're able to help de-risking the future revenue streams which contribute to those valuations. And in doing so, we can help harden the economy. Right? I think about future-proofing the economic environment around financial markets and asset ownership as a critical advantage from an economic standpoint, from an individual player, an actor in that particular marketplace. Right? It isn't just ESG reporting and governance, it's actually future-proofing the financial value of the economy.
Great. Sean, that was excellent. I have one more question, more technical question for Nicole related to our digital twin. Could you describe the way the digital twin model has been tested to date to assess its performance and adaptability?
Sure. So we for our digital twin, we have multiple different types of tests we do. One is what we call our coverage test, and the other one is what we do like feature test. Depending on like available public data sets, we measure what we already have, and then we compare that to what our underlying digital twin is. So an example is we actually found out that King County in Washington had publicly available data, and we compared that to the underlying digital twin we created. And then for our feature testing, an example of that, what we do is specifically for building coverage, given that we have collected a lot of information across, we back test that, do whole lot cross-validation, check what our imputation of a building model looks like, and then test ultimately what the results are. So that's an example of what we do. We do similar things also in our dependency and lifeline analysis for power, for transportation. So we're always collecting the best data and then testing for both coverage as well as model feature performance.
Great. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Nicole. So, I mean, I apologize. We can't take all of the great questions which you have sent us today, but we are so honored that all of you took out the time to send us questions, to attend this event. Please be assured we are going to be following up with all of you for all of these questions. And yeah, thank you so much and have a great day.